France. The year is 1600 something. In one house, a peasant girl wakes to the sound of roosters. But in another, a noble daughter opens her eyes to the soft ring of a silver bell. Her cradle is carved wood, lined with velvet. Her first toy is not a stick, but a lace doll. And waiting at her bedside, a maid, ready to dress her in fabrics most villagers will never see. From the outside, her life seems like a fairy tale. But noble childhood was not about freedom. It was about discipline, control, and preparation. From the moment she was born, she was less a child, and more a future bride. The person closest to her was not her mother. It was the wet nurse. Aristocratic women considered breastfeeding unfitting for their rank. So babies were given to other women, sometimes even sent away to the countryside. A noble daughter could spend her first years almost entirely without her mother's presence. By the age of 6, her education began. But not in numbers or science. No, her lessons were in grace, dancing, music, singing. A noble girl had to move like air, glide across the floor, and never stumble. Under Louis XIII and Louis XIV, dancing was more than art. It was politics. A bow, a step, a twirl. Each one carried meaning. One graceful move could raise her family's reputation. One mistake could bring shame. Music was next. The lute, the harpsichord, the voice. Not to become a musician, but to entertain guests, to fill salons with elegance. Here is a fact. By the late 1600s, Parisian salons run by noblewomen shaped the very culture of France. Writers, philosophers, and thinkers gathered there. And it all began with young girls learning songs by candlelight. Writing and reading were also taught. But knowledge was not the goal. Style was. Letters had to look beautiful. Words had to sound refined. It was noblewomen who made the writing of love letters fashionable, filling them with poetry and metaphors. Some of these letters still survive in French archives, a reminder of voices once hidden. Religion played its role. She learned Latin prayers, memorized catechism. But more important than faith was form, when to kneel, where to sit, how to bow in church. Even clothing became training. Heavy gowns forced her to walk upright. Corsets shaped her body, teaching discipline with every breath. And lace? Lace was not decoration. It was wealth. Here is a fact. In 17th century France, lace was often more expensive than gold. One cuff, stitched with delicate patterns, could cost more than a peasant earned in an entire year. Her voice was trained too. She was told not to laugh loudly, not to raise her tone. Her words had to be soft, measured, polite. Every gesture, every smile, every silence, rehearsed for a role she did not choose. And yet, despite the beauty, despite the education, her future was not her own. She was not raised as Anne or Marie. She was raised as the daughter of this house, a piece in a marriage contract, a pawn in a game of alliances. By 12, she might already know the name of her future husband. By 14, her family would prepare for her wedding. Her childhood was not freedom. It was rehearsal, a careful script for a life already written before she was even born. So when you imagine the childhood of a noblewoman, do not think only of jewels, music, and lace. Think also of invisible chains. Chains made of rules, of duty, of expectations. Chains as heavy as the velvet that covered her shoulders. She is 14, maybe 16. Old enough, her parents say. Old enough to marry. For noble families, marriage was not about love. It was about power. It was about land. It was about alliances. A daughter's hand could strengthen bonds between houses, could settle debts, could win favors at court. Often, she was engaged as a child. By her teenage years, she already knew the name of her future husband. Sometimes, she saw him only once before the wedding. Sometimes, not at all. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was theater, gold on the tables, jewels on the bride, silk gowns, music, feasts. A display of power for the entire community to see. But when the music stopped, reality began. From that moment, she belonged to her husband. She could not choose where to live. She could not decide who to see. She could not own property in her own right. Her duty was clear: produce heirs, preferably sons. Here is a fact. Noblewomen were often pregnant nearly every year. Many died in childbirth. Even queens were not safe. Anne of Austria, the mother of Louis XIV, endured miscarriages and years of fear before she finally gave birth to heirs. If she bore sons, her value rose. If she bore only daughters, whispers began. The pressure was constant, heavy, and merciless. Daily life was a mixture of luxury and prison. She ate from silver plates. She wore gowns worth fortunes. She had servants at her call. But her freedom was almost non-existent. Even her letters could be read by her husband or his advisors. At court, life became a dangerous game. One wrong word could destroy her reputation. One rival's rumor could end her place at court forever. To survive, many women mastered intrigue. They built networks of friends. They exchanged secret letters. They sponsored poets and musicians. They created the first Parisian salons, gatherings where politics, literature, and philosophy were discussed. These salons shaped France itself. And women were at their heart. Yet their power was fragile. For noblemen, affairs were tolerated. For noblewomen, they were deadly. A husband could flaunt his mistress. But if a wife was unfaithful, she risked disgrace, annulment, or even being forced into a convent. So she learned to smile at banquets, to play her role, to hide her fears behind lace and jewels. Her smile might look radiant, but behind it lay fear. Fear of scandal, fear of exile, fear of being replaced by a younger bride. So what was marriage for a noblewoman? It was not romance. It was duty. It was survival. A life lived under the gaze of others, where every choice was already made, long before she could dream of making one herself. The wedding feast is gone. The music has faded. Now begins the real test. She is no longer just a daughter. She is a wife, and her life is no longer her own. A noblewoman's world was made of rules, visible rules written by men, and invisible rules whispered by society. Her first duty was honor. She carried not only her own name, but the reputation of her husband's house. One careless word, one rumor, could stain the entire family. Her smile, her silence, her very presence had meaning. She was expected to manage the estate. Hundreds of servants, kitchens, storerooms, vineyards, sometimes even the family's accounts. But here is the truth. Legally, nothing belonged to her. Every action was done in her husband's name. She held responsibility without real power. Her body was also duty, pregnancy after pregnancy. Some women bore 10, 12, even 15 children. But death hovered close. 1 in 3 infants never reached adulthood. And if a child died, blame often fell on the mother. Here is a cruel fact. Miscarriages and infant deaths were often explained as punishment from God. Priests and neighbors whispered about sin. A noblewoman could carry grief and guilt that was never truly hers. Religion reinforced her cage. Mass was obligatory. Confession was constant. The priest reminded her, a good wife obeys her husband. Obedience was not just social, it was sacred. Court, her duties became heavier. She had to shine in silk, lace, and jewels. Every banquet was theater. Every gown was a statement of status. At Versailles, under Louis XIV, even dressing became public. Queens and ladies were expected to be dressed in front of an audience. Privacy, even in their most intimate moments, did not exist. Fashion itself was a burden. Corsets crushed her ribs. Breathing could be painful. Gowns weighed as much as armor, layered with fabric and embroidery. Skirts so wide they could not fit through a door. And yet, she was expected to glide, light as air. Her voice was restricted. She could not raise it in anger. She could not laugh too loudly. Grace meant silence. Self-restraint became her second skin. Even her mind was bound. She could not publish under her own name. If she wrote, Poetry, memoirs, political thoughts, it had to be in secret, or under the mask of a male pseudonym. And yet many did. The hidden voices of women echo through anonymous manuscripts of the 1600s. Daily rules surrounded her. She could not eat before her husband. She could not leave the estate without his permission. She could not inherit land if there was a male heir. Even friendships were dangerous. A letter to the wrong person could be intercepted. A visit to the wrong house could become scandal. One rumor, one whisper, and her life could collapse. And yet, noblewomen found ways to resist. Some used their wealth to sponsor artists, musicians, and philosophers. Some created salons, private gatherings where culture and politics were debated. In these rooms, ideas were born that would shape the Enlightenment itself. And women were the hosts, their voices disguised as conversation, but powerful nonetheless. Still, the balance was fragile. One jealous rival, one rumor at court, and everything could vanish, banished, forgotten, locked away in a convent. Her life was a performance, a theater of smiles, silks, and silence. Every move rehearsed, every mistake punished. So what was the life of a noblewoman? It was velvet and jewels. But it was also chains you could not see. Chains of duty, chains of silence, chains that weighed as much as the gowns on her shoulders. France, the same century, but another world. Her cradle is not lined with velvet. It is a wooden box filled with straw. No silver bell, only her mother's tired hands. Peasant girl's life began with work. By the age of 5, she carried water from the well. By 7, she helped knead bread, spin wool, or herd animals. There was no childhood as we imagine it today. She was seen as a little worker, not a student. Here is a fact. Most peasant children never learned to read. Education was for boys, and even then, usually only through a priest. Girls were taught prayers, hymns, and little else. Religion shaped her days. The church bell marked every moment. Dawn, noon, evening. Before eating, she prayed. Before sleeping, she prayed. On Sundays, the entire village gathered in church. Faith was not only belief. It was routine, law, and comfort. Her clothes were rough. Linen shifts, wool skirts, wooden clogs. Her family owned maybe 2 sets of clothing. Each patched again and again until it fell apart. Her food was simple. Bread, porridge, cabbage, beans. Meat was rare, a luxury for feast days. Fish on Fridays as the church demanded. A noble might sip spiced wine or taste sugar. She might go her whole life without tasting either. Hunger was constant. Bad harvests meant empty stomachs. And in the 1690s, famine struck. The Great Famine killed hundreds of thousands. Villagers boiled bark, grass, even leather to survive. Many women gave their food to their children, starving themselves. Here is a fact. More French peasants died from famine and disease in the 17th century than soldiers on battlefields. Play existed, but barely. She might roll a wooden hoop. She might sing songs while watching geese. Her dolls were made of rags or sticks. But even play was tied to work. Watching geese was both a game and a duty. By her teenage years, her body already carried the marks of labor. Hands rough and blistered. Back bent from lifting water and wood. Skin darkened by the sun. Her life expectancy, barely 40. Yet, in this hardship, there was also community. Villages were close-knit. Neighbors helped each other with harvests. They gathered for weddings, births, and funerals. Reputation mattered. Gossip traveled fast. A good Christian girl was obedient, hardworking, and pious. Her faith was her anchor. The priest told her that suffering was God's will, that her reward awaited in heaven. Without faith, despair would crush entire families. Here is another fact. While noblewomen shaped culture in salons, peasant women kept traditions alive through songs and oral stories. Folk tales, lullabies, and prayers passed from mother to daughter. They carried the memory of the village more faithfully than books ever could. So what was the childhood of a peasant girl? It was not lace and music. It was labor and hunger. It was fear of famine and hope in God. Her life was written not on parchment, but in calloused hands and silent prayers. She is 15, maybe 16, old enough, her parents say, old enough to marry. There is no ball, no silk gown, no contract between noble houses, only a blessing from the priest, a handshake between fathers, and a modest feast in the village. For a peasant woman, marriage was not romance. It was survival. 2 workers meant more hands in the fields. 2 incomes meant more bread for the winter. Her dowry was small: a cow, some chickens, a wooden chest, or a piece of land. Yet these simple gifts mattered far more than jewels or gold. They could keep a family alive. Weddings often happened in winter. Why? Because in winter the fields were quiet. Families finally had time to gather. There might be bread, cheese, and wine, fiddle playing, a dance around the fire, and the next morning work resumed as always. Daily life after marriage was relentless. She woke before dawn to light the fire. She baked bread, milked goats, and fed the animals. Then, with her husband, she worked in the fields, sowing, weeding, harvesting, often with a baby tied to her back. Here is a fact. Many peasant women worked in the fields until the very day they gave birth. Some returned to work within days, because survival left no time for recovery. At night, she spun wool, patched clothing, or prepared food for the next day. Rest was rare, leisure almost non-existent. Her meals were plain: bread, cabbage soup, beans. On Fridays, fish as the church demanded. Meat only for feasts, Christmas, Easter, a wedding. Water was often unsafe, so she drank weak beer, cider, or watered wine. Childbirth was constant and dangerous. Peasant women gave birth to many children, but nearly half of all children died before reaching adulthood. A mother might bury as many children as she raised. Midwives had little more than herbs, prayers, and experience. No real medicine. Every birth carried the risk of death. It was not unusual for a husband to lose both wife and child in a single night. Still, despite hardship, there was strength in community. Villagers helped each other with harvests. They shared bread in hard winters. They gathered at weddings, baptisms, funerals. No one survived alone. The church was at the center of this life. The priest blessed marriages, baptized children, and gave last rites. Holy days brought a break from endless labor. On saints' days, she could wear ribbons in her hair, dance with neighbors, and sing folk songs that echoed through the village. Here is a fact. Many of those folk songs, carried by peasant women, still survive in French folklore today. They were never written in books, but passed down by memory and voice. But limits were everywhere. She could not inherit land if a brother lived. She had no voice in village councils. She was expected to obey her husband, the priest, and tradition. Still, her strength was undeniable. She carried water heavier than her own body. She walked miles with baskets of firewood. She worked fields from sunrise to sunset. Her body bent under labor, but her spirit endured. So what was marriage for a peasant woman? It was not lace, not jewels, not power. It was labor. It was hunger and hope carried side by side. Her wedding day gave her no freedom, but it gave her survival and the chance to build a family, one prayer and one harvest at a time. Her name will never be written in the royal chronicles. Her portrait will never hang in gilded halls. But she is the face of France, the silent foundation of an entire kingdom. The life of a peasant woman was built on struggle. Struggle against hunger, against disease, against war, against a world that never gave her rest. Hunger was her greatest enemy. Bad harvests meant famine. The Great Famine of the 1690s struck with brutal force. Crops failed, winters froze, grain prices soared. Entire villages starved. Families boiled bark, grass, even leather to stay alive. Women gave their share to their children, watching their own bodies waste away. Here is a fact. More people died in those famine years than in many of the wars France fought at the same time. Peasant women carried that burden most directly. Disease was everywhere. Smallpox, typhus, plague. Few families escaped untouched. Medicine was primitive. A priest's blessing, an herbal tea, or a bleeding with a knife. These were the only treatments. One infection could wipe out a family. War brought more suffering. When armies marched, peasants paid the price. Fields were burned, grain stolen, barns emptied. Women hid children in forests, praying soldiers would pass by. Often they did not. Yet through all this, faith held her together. Every Sunday, she walked to the stone church at the center of the village. She knelt, she prayed, she confessed. The priest told her that her suffering was God's will, that heaven was her true reward. And she believed. Without faith, despair would have crushed her. Faith gave her meaning, but faith also kept her bound. The church taught obedience. A good wife obeys her husband. A good daughter obeys her father. A good woman accepts her suffering in silence. Still, her strength was undeniable. She carried buckets heavier than her body. She worked fields pregnant, gave birth in pain, and returned to work days later. She kept families alive through famine, winter, and war. Here is a fact. While noblewomen filled salons with poets, it was peasant women who kept traditions alive. Through songs, prayers, and stories whispered by firelight, they preserved the culture of rural France. These voices, passed from mother to daughter, became the true memory of the common people. Community was her shield. Neighbors gathered for weddings, harvests, funerals. They shared bread, wine, stories, and grief. When one family starved, another gave what little they had. Without this network of women helping each other, villages would not have survived. Her legacy was not written in books. It was written in endurance. In the children who lived because she went hungry. In the harvests she brought in with blistered hands. In the hymns she sang even when her body ached. So what was the life of a peasant woman in 17th century France? It was labor without rest. It was hunger without end. It was faith without question. But it was also strength. A strength that carried families, villages, and a kingdom itself. The noblewoman's name might be remembered. The queen's portrait might be preserved. But without the peasant woman, there would be no France to rule. History may forget her, but the ashes of time remember, and her silent endurance still echoes today.